Under this fractional reserve scheme, we inevitably become debt slaves to a ruling class of financial elite, not because they are better or smarter than anyone else, but because they have rigged the system to benefit themselves at the expense of most people on the planet. Catherine Austin Fitts is an expert on this issue. She was an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President George Bush Sr., and then an advisor to the Clinton administration.
Let's set up a game of Monopoly and you want to buy Park Place. What I can continually do is just print money, give myself more money, lower the value of your money by printing more. No matter how hardworking you are or how successful you are, I can always end up buying you for free.
So how come if you or I make up money, it's called counterfeiting, but if the banks do it, it's increasing the money supply? How did the banks get this power? This is Jekyll Island, where in 1910, representatives from the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Morgans, and other private bankers gathered, secretly, to draft the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve. Ed Griffin literally wrote the book on what happened at Jekyll Island.
Central banks are banking cartels which have gone into partnership with the respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given monopolistic power over the creation of the nation's money supply. That's what the politicians handed to them as a gift, you might say, for the partnership. Now, in return, what did the bankers do for the politicians? They promised to create money out of nothing, now that they've got this legal power to do it anytime the government needs it.
And since 2008, we've witnessed the greatest fake money printing run in recorded history. This financial sleight of hand disguises the costs, hides who's to blame, and leaves us as debt slaves working to pay off the bill. I found it revealing that in the same year the Federal Reserve was founded, 1913, the Internal Revenue Service was also established. An income tax was then instigated so you and I would have to pay the politicians' debt plus interest to the bankers.
The problem is we have a privately owned central bank system in the United States disguised as a government-owned system. Now, if you look in the telephone book here in the Washington, D.C. area, you look up for Federal Reserve in the blue government pages, it's not there. It's in the white pages right next to Federal Express. It's a privately owned central bank.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
We have a private bank that prints money on behalf of the Treasury. The Federal Reserve prints money on a debt-based system which creates scarcity. But it puts a group of insiders in a position of having access to all the data about the economy when we don't. So you have a small group of bankers who understand the data on how the money works in the economy, and it gives them the ability to print money in a way that the insiders are protected and everybody else is drained.
Catherine went on to compare a healthy economy to a vibrant torus, balanced, freely flowing, and energized throughout, in contrast to what's happening in our current economy.
What you have is a system that's very dynamic, and it's trying to optimize. But intertwined in the core of it, you have a tapeworm. The way a tapeworm works in your body is it injects a chemical into your body that makes you crave what's good for the tapeworm and bad for you. You have a parasite that's very much manipulating and engorging itself at the expense of the whole.
We live in a tapeworm economy where the financial elite are the tapeworm and they're feeding on us. And they don't like it when people blow their cover. After Catherine began exposing government corruption at the highest levels, the FBI raided her company and seized its assets. She was dragged through the courts for 10 years before being found innocent. So we've got the Federal Reserve, a privately owned corporation with a monopoly on creating money, but with no accountability, backed up by a government with a monopoly on force. The country got sold on the Fed as an institution that would help stabilize the economy and remain independent of politics. But in fact, in close to a century of existence, the Federal Reserve has done just the opposite. Since they took charge, we've been robbed through inflation, and the purchasing power of the dollar has declined more than 96%. And the wealth gap makes it clear most of the money is going to a very few. Only 16 years after the Federal Reserve was in power, America experienced the Great Depression. My research revealed that before the big crash in 1929, the elite bankers pulled their money out of the stock market. After the crash, they used that money to buy up cheap stocks and smaller failing banks for pennies on the dollar. Among the bankers who consolidated their wealth this way were the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans. A similar scenario played out in the 2008 financial collapse, with the same bankers benefiting. In the years leading up to the collapse, the biggest banks, including Bank of America, Citigroup, and Chase, controlled by the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans, were bundling and trading bad loans that they knew would eventually fail. It's like putting rotten oranges in a box and selling them as grade AAA. The bundlers of the debt knew it was only a matter of time before someone would open that box and see that the content was worthless, since they were the ones who packed the boxes in the first place. When the rotten oranges, what we hear about as unsound loans, derivatives, and credit default swaps, were finally discovered, everyone was impacted. People lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses, and their retirements. Meanwhile, the biggest banks who created the problem in the first place were the ones who got bailed out. Why's that? Why would the Federal Reserve give trillions to the banks, even though the majority of Americans were against bailing them out? And why not help those most in need rather than the perpetrators of the financial collapse? My research led me to believe that the same people who created the Federal Reserve, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans, still control it, and they use this scheme to bail themselves out at our expense.
Many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they, frankly, own the place.
I'm convinced that the near collapse of the economy in 2008 resulted from an orchestrated pump-and-dump scheme designed and executed by the big bankers to consolidate wealth and power. David Icke explains how he sees the Federal Reserve rigging the so-called business cycles.
Stage one, it's like throwing a fishing line out. Stage one, you put lots of money, units of exchange, into circulation. You do this by pushing interest rates down, by making lots of loans. This is the part of the cycle we call a boom. Because there's lots of units of exchange in circulation, there's lots of money changing hands. That generates lots of economic activity. That generates jobs. And as more and more money is spent, there's more demand. So companies take out more loans of fresh air money to increase their production. People get confident in their everyday lives. Hey, you know, I work for this company. They've got lots of orders. It's really going great. My job's safe. I tell you what, we can have a bigger house. Then they start to change it. What they do is they pull the fishing line in. They push interest rates up. Now, fewer people, are taking out loans, and they make the criteria for having a loan from the bank stronger anyway. And also, now, as interest rates have gone up, a larger part of people's income is going to pay back the extra interest and not being circulated in buying things. Suddenly, there's nothing like as much money in circulation, and therefore, fewer things are being bought.
companies start to go down in terms of their profits, they start to shed jobs, and they start to go out of business. People lose their jobs, they can't pay the mortgage anymore of the big house they took out in the good times. Now what the banks are doing is starting to reel the fishing line in, because as they go bankrupt, companies and individuals, the banks get the real wealth, the property, the land, the resources that they had signed to them for lending merely figures on a screen. Now this economic cycle of fishing line out, fishing line back, lots of units in circulation, pull them in, has been going on for centuries. And what it's done, it's stolen and accumulated the real wealth of the world in the hands of the few.
At the international level, central bankers use the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to make more money while exploiting the resources of countries they lend to, bankrupting them in the process. The central bank of central banks is the Rothschild-created Bank for International Settlements. The elite are positioning themselves to control access to virtually everything we need to survive.
No matter where you go in the world, the money is controlled by the banking system. They decide if people eat or if they don't eat. Who's a billionaire and who lives on less than $1 a day? He who controls the money controls the world, and a very few control the money.
At this point, my view of the world had been turned upside down. I was struggling with the realization that the failure and suffering of so many is actually success and fulfillment for a few. The elite central bankers who fooled the world into letting them create money. They already have vast fortunes, so what is their end game? What is their ultimate agenda?
Hello and welcome to Money Trail with me, Amir Arafat. Today, the international banking cartel, from the Rothschilds to the House of Morgan to the Federal Reserve. Who controls the world's money? The four horsemen of banking, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, own the four horsemen of oil, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and Chevron Texaco. In tandem with Deutsche Bank, BNP, Barclays, and other European old money behemoths. But their monopoly over the global economy does not end at the edge of the oil patch. According to company 10-K filings to the SEC, the four horsemen of banking are among the top 10 stockholders of virtually every Fortune 500 corporation.
The fact is 52% of the New York Fed is owned by these 8 families. It's the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, Goldman Sachs, Lehmans, Lazards, Warburgs, Kuhn Loebs, and Israel Moses Seifs. And the latter family, that goes back to the Genoese bankers, you know, when they first moved into Europe. And these are just really old families. And you know the saying, money begets more money. You know, you got to have money to make money. Well, guess what? These people had money in the 16th century, whatever. And so, you know, many people estimate that the Rothschilds, the richest of these families, are worth over $100 trillion.
The international banking cartel is a consortium of about 15 to 20 to 25 international banks of large magnitude with large amounts of political influence. These are the too big to fail banks around the world. They're too big to fail. They're too big to jail. And they are essentially the ones who control the private central banks of the world, because in most countries, United States, Britain, Germany, Japan, and so on down the line, the central bank is a privately controlled institution, even if it's not always, formally speaking, privately owned.
The control that these banking families exert over the global economy cannot be overstated and is quite intentionally shrouded in secrecy. Their corporate media arm is quick to discredit any information exposing this private central banking cartel as conspiracy theory, yet the facts remain.
And what my book is about is how they've established this total monopoly over the 3 most valuable commodities in the world: guns, drugs, and oil. And then, worse yet, they've taken over the central banks of every country, not just the Federal Reserve, but the Bank of England, the Bundesbank, the Bank of France, Bank of Australia. I mean, you name it. And it's just stranger than fiction that this can happen. But these banking cartels with our fiat currency system, where they can print more money, lend out more money than they actually have in reserve, and the government backs it.
We have the Royal Bank of Scotland. We have HSBC, that's the old Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Lloyds Bank, TSB, that has absorbed HBOS, Building Society. That is followed then by Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, UBS, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank and Westdeutsche Landesbank of Germany, Société Générale of France, the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi UJF, Norin Chukin of Japan, Royal Bank of Canada, and Rabobank of the Netherlands. Now that group, 15, 16 banks, that is essentially the heart of the cartel.
One important repository for the wealth of the global oligarchy that owns these bank holding companies is U.S. Trust Corporation, founded in 1853 and now owned by Bank of America. A recent U.S. Trust corporate director and honorary trustee was Walter Rothschild. Other directors included Daniel Davison of J.P. Morgan Chase, Richard Tucker of ExxonMobil, Daniel Roberts of Citigroup, and Marshall Schwartz of Morgan Stanley.
Basically, it's like these families are running this printing press, and they get countries in debt, they get individuals in debt, they get companies in debt, and when those people go into debt and can't pay their loans back, then these bankers come in and seize the real asset, which is the house, the car, the Mexican National Cement Company, which is what they did in the Mexican debt crisis in 1997. The way they got out of that was they handed over other state assets to ASARCO, and BNN took over the whole railroad in Mexico. And, it's just it's a scam.
And now the world's biggest and perhaps oldest modern banking family. Ladies and gentlemen, the Rothschilds. In 1694, William III teamed up with the UK aristocracy to launch the Private Bank of England. The Rothschilds and their inbred 8 families partners gradually came to control the Bank of England. Mayor Amschel Rothschild once said, quote, "I care not who controls a nation's political affairs, so long as I control her currency."
When Amschel Meyer Bauer inherited the business, he decided to change his name to Rothschild. Amschel soon learned that loaning money to governments and kings was more profitable than loaning to private individuals. Not only were the loans bigger, but they were secured by the nation's taxes. Mayer Rothschild had 5 sons. He trained them all in the skills of money creation, then sent them out to the major capitals of Europe to open branch offices of the family banking business. His first son, Amschel Meyer, stayed in Frankfurt to mind the hometown bank. His second son, Solomon, was sent to Vienna. His third son, Nathan, was clearly the most clever. He was sent to London at age 21 in 1798, 100 years after the founding of the Bank of England. His fourth son, Karl, went to Naples, and his fifth son, Jacob, went to Paris. Rothschilds soon grew unbelievably wealthy. By the mid-1800s, they dominated all European banking and were certainly the wealthiest family in the world.
The Rothschild family was a German banking family. Their original name was Bauer. They changed their name to Rothschild. The sons of Mayer Amschel Bauer Rothschild were spread out across Europe. They funded all sides of all conflicts. I guess the most famous instance of that is when they funded the Duke of Wellington and Bonaparte's army.
They financed the Crimean War, and they financed, Napoleon and all that stuff. Wellington, both sides of that conflict, and that was the pattern. They started getting the royal families of Europe into debt to them, so they'd owe them money.
This is the Waterloo battlefield about 200 miles northeast of Paris in what today is Belgium. Here, Napoleon suffered his final defeat, but not before thousands of French and Englishmen gave their lives on a steamy summer day in July of 1815. The outcome was certainly in doubt. In fact, had Napoleon attacked a few hours earlier, he would probably have won the battle. But no matter who won or lost, back in London, Nathan Rothschild planned to use the opportunity to try to seize control over the British stock and bond market and possibly even the Bank of England. The day after the Battle of Waterloo, in a matter of hours, Nathan Rothschild came to dominate not only the bond market, but the Bank of England as well. Whether or not the Rothschild family seized control of the Bank of England, the first privately owned central bank in a major European nation and the wealthiest, one thing is certain. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds were the richest family in the world, bar none. Over 2 centuries, disguising what they're doing, disguising what the ownership of their corporations is. There is no reliable information on the magnitude of their wealth in this day and age.
Author Frederick Morton estimates that by 1850, the Rothschilds were worth over $10 billion. Some researchers believe that their fortune today exceeds $100 trillion.
That's how the Rothschilds started, was by funding these wars in Europe, and they just gained power. You know, the Rockefellers in America were financed by the Rothschilds, along with the Kuhn-Loeb family.
They financed Cecil Rhodes, making it possible for him to establish a monopoly over the diamond and gold fields of South Africa. In America, they financed the Harrimans in railroads, the Vanderbilts in railroads and the press, and Carnegie in the steel industry, among many others. In fact, during World War I, J.P. Morgan was thought to be the richest man in America. But after his death, it was discovered that he was actually only a lieutenant of the Rothschilds. By 1850, James Rothschild, the heir of the French branch of the family, was said to be worth 600 million French francs, 150 million more than all the other bankers in France put together. He built this mansion called Ferrier, just east of Paris. Wilhelm I, on seeing it, exclaimed, "Kings couldn't afford this. It could only belong to a Rothschild."
At the heart of the whole Rothschild money accumulation was that relationship they had with these royals. And then, then they started acquiring control of all these central banks. And once again, once you have, $1 billion, easy to make 10 billion. Once you have 10 billion, 100 billion's nothing. Once you have that, 100 trillion's nothing.
Today, the Rothschilds control a far-flung financial empire, which includes majority stakes in most world central banks. They are founding members of the exclusive $10 trillion Club of the Isles, which controls corporate giants Royal Dutch Shell, Imperial Chemical Industries, Lloyds of London, Unilever, Barclays, Lorno, Rio Tinto Zinc, BHP Billiton. The Club of Isles is led by the Rothschilds and includes Queen Elizabeth II and other wealthy European aristocrats and black nobility. It dominates the world's supply of petroleum, gold, diamonds, and many other vital raw materials.
You can't tell the difference between, the Rothschilds and the Royals. It's all the same stuff. And they have joint investments. The biggest investment, I believe, is the Quantum NV Fund, which is based in Curacao, which interestingly is also home to the biggest oil refineries in the Western Hemisphere. It's just north of Venezuela, so they take all that Venezuelan crude, they take Nigerian crude there, they have these huge refineries, Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil own them. And they also have this Quantum NV Fund, a lot of offshore stuff happens there.
How about the American version of the Rothschilds? Who started banking in the U.S.? The House of Morgan presided over American finance from the corner of Wall Street, acting as quasi-U.S. central bank since 1838, when George Peabody founded it in London. The Morgan financial octopus wrapped its tentacles quickly around the globe. Morgan Grenfell operated in London. Morgan & Sioux ruled Paris. The Rothschilds' Lambert cousins set up Drexel & Company in Philadelphia. The House of Morgan financed the launch of AT&T, General Motors, General Electric, and DuPont. Like the London-based Rothschild and Barings banks, Morgan became part of a power structure in many countries.
Morgan was the official U.S. representative of the City of London and British banking. He was London's man in New York City. This gave him dominant power.
A recession in 1893 enhanced Morgan's power. That year, Morgan saved the U.S. government from a bank panic, forming a syndicate to prop up government reserves with a shipment of $62 million worth of Rothschild gold.
The origin of the situation we're in now, right? Where do we get this world banking cartel, and how do they control the finances and the central banks of these countries? It actually takes us back to 1895, and this was an attack on the United States organized by London and by Morgan. And the goal was to force the U.S. Off the gold standard by buying up all the gold that was in the backing of the U.S. dollar. And at the height of the crisis, there's a meeting between Grover Cleveland and the current Morgan of those days. Grover Cleveland was the president of the United States, and essentially Morgan said, London and I demand to control the U.S. public debt, and if you do that, we'll stop attacking the dollar. But if you don't, we'll wreck the dollar, we'll cause a depression, and that will be the end of you. And at that point, Grover Cleveland surrendered to London and to Morgan.
Morgan was a driving force behind Western expansion in the U.S., financing and controlling westbound railroads through voting trusts. The House of Morgan was cozy with the British House of Windsor and the Italian House of Savoy. The Kuhn-Loebs, Warburgs, Lehmans, Lazards, Israel Moses Sieves, and Goldman Sachs also had close ties to European royalty. By 1895, Morgan controlled the flow of gold in and out of the U.S. The House of Morgan financed half the U.S. World War I effort, while receiving commissions for lining up contractors like GE, DuPont, U.S. Steel, Cavalcade, and Sarco. Morgan also financed the British Boer War in South Africa and the Franco-Prussian War. The 1919 Paris Peace Conference was presided over by Morgan, which led both German and Allied reconstruction efforts. Money makes strange bedfellows. How the Morgans and Rockefellers came together. In 1879, Cornelius Vanderbilt's Morgan-financed New York Central Railroad gave preferential shipping rates to John D. Rockefeller's budding Standard Oil monopoly, cementing the Rockefeller-Morgan relationship. Morgan and Edward Harriman's banker Kuhn-Loeb held a monopoly over the railroads, while banking dynasties Lehman, Goldman Sachs, and Lazard joined the Rockefellers in controlling the U.S. industrial base.
The Morgans financed all the railroads, and Rockefeller at that time was, just another guy on the oil patch. And what he did is he cut deals with the railroads based on volume, that they would transport his crude at a better rate than other people got. And so, not only that, but he started selling oil. He started selling oil below cost to refiners. And what that did is it drove a lot of wildcatters out of business in Texas, Louisiana, because that you can't sell oil for less than the price it costs to produce, right? Unless you're John Rockefeller. And so he ran them out of business, and then he bought all the refineries. But that's the most notable instance where, J.P. Morgan, early on with the railroads helped the Rockefeller family and vice versa. Well, what you have now is J.P. Morgan Chase. So, see, the Chase Bank has always been the Rockefeller Bank, the big one, and along with Citigroup. But the Citigroup, James Stillman and some other families that have big chunks of that, Harkness family. But Chase has always been the Rockefeller Bank.
In the insurance business, the Rockefellers control Metropolitan Life, Equitable Life, Prudential, and New York Life. The Rockefeller banks control 25% of all assets of the 50 largest U.S. commercial banks and 30% of all assets of the 50 largest insurance companies. Companies under Rockefeller control include ExxonMobil, Chevron Texaco, BP, Marathon Oil, Freeport McMoran, Quaker Oats, Sarco, United Delta, Northwest, ITT, International Harvester, Xerox, Boeing, Westinghouse, Hewlett-Packard, Honeywell, International Paper, Pfizer, Motorola, Union Carbide, and General Foods. Speaking of the international banking cartel, how about the U.S. Federal Reserve? Where does the Fed stand?
The Federal Reserve is a center of it. It's really one of the governing institutions. By the way, let me say, I write about this in my book, Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Greatest Financial Crisis in Human History. And here on the cover, we have the Fed breaking up.
Everyone who can read the writing on the wall can see the Federal Reserve Bank controls the United States government. They control every aspect of the economy, and they are controlled by a international bank according to the rules that everybody knows. Basel III. That's the rules by which all the private central banks operate, and it's set in a foreign country, which means the Federal Reserve Bank is a treasonous institution that destroys or has destroyed American sovereignty, as has the European Central Bank and the banks around the world, as has, every nation where these Rothschild central banks operate out of.
How about the central bank of all central banks? The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The Bank for International Settlements is the most powerful bank in the world, a global central bank for the 8 families who control the private central banks of almost all Western and developing nations. The Bank for International Settlements is owned by the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, Bank of Italy, Bank of Canada, Swiss National Bank, Nederlandsche Bank, Bundesbank, and Bank of France.
Naturally, it's a sinister institution, right? Secretive, wealthy, with no accountability, no transparency, no TV cameras, no nothing, all secret. This is the kind of thing that would have to end.
It's hard to find out about it, for sure. This BIS crowd, Bank of International Settlements, it's in Basel, Switzerland. It's a central bank for central bankers. It keeps its head low. It's owned by the same families, and basically only comes out in times of extreme crisis.
The Bank for International Settlements has been operating in Basel since, I believe, 1931, 1932. And it grows out of a distant world, but which is not so dissimilar from our own world. If you go back to the period after World War I, the most dangerous kind of financial debt were the reparations that Germany was required to pay billions and billions of dollars as a result of losing World War I and being blamed for World War I, which was not historically true. But it was impossible to have the reparations paid. Germany simply could not pay. Lord Keynes saw this at the time. Many others saw it at the time. So there were constant attempts to reorganize the reparations and keep them going. One was the Dawes Plan of 1923-24, and then there was the Young Plan of 1931-32, which also created the Bank for International Settlement.
Historian Carroll Quigley wrote in his epic book Tragedy and Hope that Bank for International Settlements was part of a plan to, quote, create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements.
The international banking cartel that controls the central banks of all but 3 nations operates under the rules set by an international body called the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And the central banks of the world, from the United States to Russia to China, they all operate under Basel III, is what's being transitioned into now. And Basel III is the rules by which all of these banks operate. And there's, complex organizations, international organizations, and secret societies that carry out the will of these banks. And, the leadership of those groups are the major stockholders of the Bank for International Settlements.
The Bank for International Settlements holds at least 10% of monetary reserves for at least 80 of the world's central banks, the IMF, and other multilateral institutions. It serves as financial agent for international agreements, collects information on the global economy, and serves as lender of last resort to prevent global financial collapse. It served as conduit for 8 families' funding of Adolf Hitler, led by Warburg's Henry Schroeder, and Mendelssohn Bank of Amsterdam. Many researchers assert the Bank for International Settlements is a detonator of global drug money laundering.
It's It's a banking cartel that prints money out of thin air and charges people interest and leverages its war machine, which exhibits itself in the Russian military, the United States military, the Chinese military, and they play different nationalities of people off of one another in order to enslave the planet and consolidate their power.
Politicians often declare wars, but who are the true warmongers? Who are the people that fund the wars? Who are the true war profiteers?
The controlling of the money supply and the economy is only a portion of the power the international bankers wield against us. The next tool for profit and control is war. Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, it seems as if we have been in a perpetual war at one place or another. There's a reason for this. It's important to understand that the most lucrative thing that can happen for the international bankers is war, for it forces the country to borrow even more money from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest. Not only that, but they have heavy investments in the weapons manufacturers.
Guns, drugs, oil. If you look at the numbers, it's the three most valuable commodities in the world. So if you're a banker, you're going to want war. You can sell oil to both sides, you can sell guns to both sides, and you can run drugs through the war zone and nobody will know where it's going, and launder that money easily. Big old stacks of $100 bills, also gold and diamonds, all these things go through war zones as currency. And of course they own the defense contractors. These same families own Lockheed Martin, they own BAE, British Aerospace, they own all the biggest defense contractors.
I receive letters from many people who tell me about the things that concern them, especially about the things they believe are important and that they want me to address in one of these broadcasts. Their concerns cover a wide range. Some people tell me you should talk about the Freemasons. Masons are involved in every aspect of the conspiracy to destroy our civilization and impose the New World Order on us. Well, maybe so. I really don't know much about Freemasonry. I do know some people who are Masons, though, and I'm quite sure that if the Masonic organizations to which they belong are engaged in some sort of sinister conspiracy, the fellows I know haven't been let in on it. It could be that at the higher levels, 32nd degree and so on, there's a lot of nasty stuff going on that they don't tell the rank and file about. Certainly, many men who should have been hanged, drawn, and quartered for their crimes against our people, mostly politicians of one stripe or another, are or have been Masons. But I just don't know enough about Freemasonry to talk about it. Other people who write to me are quite concerned about the Federal Reserve System. They tell me that it's illegal, that there's some sort of legal irregularity in the way the system was set up. They tell me that it's a system designed to enrich a few bankers at the expense of everyone else. They tell me that it's a Jewish system, and they point to the very Jewish chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Greenspan. And they tell me that the Federal Reserve System is at the root of our problems and that I should talk about it. Most of my broadcasts have been related in one way or another to the two issues I believe are most important for us to understand and to deal with. These central issues around which everything else revolves are race and the Jews. We can figure out how to straighten out our banking system after we have regained control of our mass media and won the demographic battle. If we don't win that, we'll have no chance to deal with banking or anything else. The Jews of Hollywood hate us with the same insane hatred that the Jewish secret police commissars had for the Polish officers and intellectuals. They butchered by the thousands in bars, with the same insane hatred that was expressed in Propaganda Commissar Ilya Ehrenberg's exhortations to the Red Army to rape German women and murder German children. They don't yet have the power to murder us wholesale the way they did in Ukraine and Estonia. They would if they did.
When you're ready to rise up, you'll rise up. All the power you need is in your hands. Now look around you. Our financial systems have been hijacked by a generation of thieves. While you're working harder and harder for less and less, the game is being rigged against you. They're turning all of us into virtual slaves. Looters, at the heart of our financial system, are price-fixing our most precious resources. Food, water, energy, gold, even the value of money itself is being siphoned away by high-level crooks in a giant mushrooming conspiracy of unstoppable corruption. They're robbing billions of people of trillions of dollars a year, folks. There is no need for austerity measures. There is no need for financial suffering. No need for poverty. There is no scarcity. We are simply the victims of a robbery of unimaginable proportions. We have been fed a lie so vast it oppresses all of humanity. The truth is, there is more than enough to go around. 60 years ago, productivity was increasing so fast, they predicted by today, entire families could live comfortably on the income of just one provider, working only 10 hours a week. They wondered what we'd do with all of our spare time. What happened to that dream? Turns out they were right. What took a full work week back then can be done in just 10 hours today. We have technologies that multiply our efforts 1,000-fold and connect us in ways they never imagined. We are now 100 times richer than in that great heyday of the 50s. We are heirs to a great bounty of prosperity, $70 trillion in the U.S. alone, over $200,000 for every man, woman, and child. The only reason we don't experience this wealth is because it's being siphoned away by a corrupt criminal class. They loot through giant corporations, raising prices, lowering wages, stealing the fruits of our productivity. Where once whole families prospered with just one provider, now both parents work, delivering 8 times the productivity but struggling to make ends meet. They control the media using hot-button social issues to divide us, brother against brother, so we fight each other while they loot our sacred institutions. They make us fear too big to fail banks collapsing, but if they did, we'd suddenly recover the 8 times our income that's being siphoned away every single day. Don't give yourselves to these crooks who abuse you and enslave you, who steal your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel. Let us burn these leeches off our backs. Let us replace their corrupt systems with better systems that benefit everyone. Let us reclaim the fruits of our productivity. Let us share our prosperity. We can do this now. We are the creators, and when we come together, we have the power to create whatever future we want.